Hi, I'm Adam and welcome back to First Man Photography. In today's video, we are going wide to see the bigger picture as I share my ultimate guide to panorama photography. Before we get going today though, this video is sponsored by Squarespace. If you need a domain name, a website, or an online store, make your next move with Squarespace. So panoramas, they are big, they are wide, they are beautiful, but they are not always the easiest thing to create. With our phones, it is actually really easy because you just turn on the pano mode and kind of pan around and it does it all automatically for you, but it's not going to give you the best quality that your camera can do. So I want to take you through the whole process, right from talking about the lenses, up to the composition, up to how to actually do it, then a bit about post-processing, and then we're going to finish off with presenting our beautiful work as a print, because panos don't look particularly good on the screen, but when you print them out, they're just so exciting. I would love it if you were to come with me, subscribe to this channel if you like this kind of content and all my other stuff going out and about, and hit the like button as well, which really supports me. So let's get on with it. The truth is, you can do panorama photography with pretty much any lens. Personally, I like to use something like this, a 70-200, because I shoot a lot of landscapes, or pretty much only landscapes. Quite often with your panoramas, the scene that you're shooting may be quite far away, so having the longer lens to be able to get into that view is beneficial. But if you were doing something like architecture or something in a wood where you wanted to do a pano, something wider would work. One of my very favorite lenses to use for panoramas though is a tilt shift lens, and I've done this before and it just creates perfect panoramas that stitch together so well, because essentially what you're doing is as you shift the lens, it will grab that shot square and there'll be no distortion whatsoever, and it's just a really nice way to do panoramas, particularly true with architecture and things like that where you might want the straight lines as well. But yeah, I use this 70-200, which is perfect for panos, and we'll talk a little bit more about why that is in the next section. When it comes to composing a panorama photograph, we really shouldn't be thinking about the composition any differently to how we would normally compose a photograph. Essentially, all it is a different option in our toolkit around the aspect ratio of the photograph that we're making. Where I think panoramas really shine is when you want to capture that wide view, and because it almost gives the illusion that you're there when you're viewing it. If you are stood in an environment like that, or in a beautiful landscape, you have that peripheral vision and you have that ability to look around and soak it all in. And by having that big, wide piece of artwork, it almost recreates that and gives that kind of expanse of space that you get when you are there. And that's part of, I think, what inspires people about panoramas, especially when you see it in print, because you can kind of do the same thing and look from left to right along that piece of work. So when I talk about composition normally, I talk a lot about inclusion and exclusion. What do you want to include in your frame? But just as importantly, and especially with panorama photography, is what are we going to exclude from the frame as well? Because if you are stood in a location with a beautiful scene in front of you that you want to capture as a panorama, more than likely, there is going to be a lot of space immediately in front of you and the sky above you that you don't want in your frame. So essentially, we want that strip in the distance with a landscape often that we can see that looks beautiful. And that is why this long lens works so well, because it allows us to exclude the immediate ground in front of us and the sky. Because if you just did a really wide view, by the time you have panned your image around, the actual bit of detail, the bit that you want in your photograph once it's stitched together, will be a really thin band across the middle. So if you can get zoomed in to, say, 200 millimeters and pull that detail out when you're shooting it with the lens, you're going to end up with a much better image with much higher detail and resolution as well. And then I'm just thinking about where do I want this image to start and finish left to right. And usually it may be that I want to give a bit of breathing space to a tree, or I want to cut the mountain off where two mountain peaks kind of go into a valley. That often works as a really nice spot to cut your panorama off on the left or the right. But it's going to totally depend on what you have in front of you. Another way that a panorama comes in really handy is this. If you say you're in a woodland and you can't move any further back, you don't have a wide enough lens to get it all in, you can use a panorama to essentially widen the angle of your frame without having a wider lens. That works up and down and left to right. So how do we shoot a panorama? Essentially, we're going to take a series of images across that width that we want, or that top to bottom, and combine them in post-processing. Generally, what I will do is shoot a left to right panorama, do it vertically, because then you're getting the maximum resolution from your lens and your sensor rather, top to bottom rather than left to right. We then, once we've done that, are going to, with each image that we take, as we pan around, I want to overlap the previous one by a third. Now, some people will do 2/3 and you end up with less images, but it's safe. The less you overlap, the safer it's going to be in terms of being able to stitch it together in post-processing. We then need to think about the settings of our camera. And it's really, really important that with any panorama, you do it in manual exposure mode, because you don't want the light to unnaturally change across your scene. And you want to expose for the brightest part of your frame. We also really do want to be in manual focus, because even that slight adjustment of focus as we pan around could make a difference. That's particularly true if your subject is closer to you. On a distant mountain scene, it's not going to matter as much. You could get away with doing it in autofocus, but get used to focusing, locking it into manual mode with a little switch. It's essentially a set it and forget it situation where we then start making the panorama. Once we've got our settings, it's then time to take the photograph. And there's a few different ways that we can do that. And I think one of my favorites is to do it handheld. If you're going to do it handheld, you want to boost that shutter speed up even more. So I'm boosting the ISO, boosting the shutter speed. One of the tips I received, that's one of the best I've ever had for handheld panos, is to essentially point your feet to where you're going to finish. So then twist your body around at the hips to the start point, and then just almost allow your hips to drag you around to point straight where your feet are. And it ends up a really nice, smooth pano. If we want to take it a step further though, we're going to need a tripod. And if you use a tripod, it's really, really important to get the tripod completely level. You're then going to need a tripod head that will rotate around the y-axis essentially. A ball head like this, where you've just got one control and then it sort of the whole thing comes undone, is going to be no good, because whilst it will rotate around there, once that's loosened, the ball head moves up and down as well. So it's really difficult to maintain the pan. So you want a slightly better ball head that will or any kind of head that will rotate around that y-axis. And like I said, another way is to use a tilt shift lens, or any camera that has a shift function on it. These images here are produced with a tilt shift lens, and I personally just think they're just beautiful. So with all that said, let's head out and about briefly to see an image that I made a little while ago in stunning conditions in the Lake District. Rainbow's coming already. I knew that was going to happen. Damn it, I missed that one. I think I'll have another one though, because the rain just moved over my head and then the sun is following it. So I'm hopeful that another rainbow is going to turn up. But the composition's just not what I was hoping for. But we'll work at it a little bit and see if we can make something happen. Right, this is absolutely hilarious. The rain has come again. The sun was there and it's coming in and out now. But what I did, I've used my brain a little bit and resolved my issues with the focal length in a way that you can do if your lens is too long for the width you want to do. A very simple tactic is to do a panorama. And as you can see, that rainbow now is just streaking across me. So I'm all focused in, and I'm just gonna, let me have a quick look, make sure I get the first one right. So I'm focused in, and I'm just gonna go a third in each time, but I need the sun to last for as long as I get round. And I've done it once already when the same rainbow was there, and I didn't quite get to the end, so that side of it is not gonna be in my image. Hopefully that sun will last enough time. Oh, look at that rainbow, it's absolutely fantastic. So I'm just going a third into the frame each time. I'll tell you the settings in a minute. F11, 1/80th of a second. ISO 100, come on, I'm getting there. It's fading again. I think it's actually a double rainbow. Probably not going to get that in. Come on, sun, stay with me. One more frame. Look how intense it is. Oh, wow. As it starts to fade again as the sun goes in. Oh my goodness, look at that rainbow. Absolutely stunning. Right, so we're going to have a look at how I've post-processed that image in a minute, then talk a bit about Parallax Shift, and then we are going to print the work, which I'm excited about. But before we do that, as you know, this video is sponsored by Squarespace. And Squarespace is just the very best place for photographers to create their website for a number of reasons, and not least because it's just so easy to do. You don't need very much technical knowledge whatsoever. You're just dragging a few blocks around and you put some of your images on there, a little bit of your text, and before you know it, you will have a beautiful and unique looking website that you've built on top of one of their templates. If you want to, then you can upgrade your site to an online store, and that's what I've done for my new Continuum project, where I'm selling the prints that I make in these videos when I'm out and about. If you do then run into a small issue, they have superb customer service. A few occasions when I've needed to speak to them, I just jump on the chat. They get back to me straight away. They're super helpful, super polite, and just great to deal with. I've used them for years and I have never ever looked back. So go to squarespace.com to start your free trial today. And then if you like what you've created, use the offer code FIRSTMAN to get 10% off your first purchase. So back home, we've loaded our images onto our computer. I've selected the ones from the panorama I took here of the rainbow. We're doing this in Lightroom. You can do it in Photoshop as well, but we're just going to highlight all of those images, right click on it, and then go to Photo, Merge, Panorama. So it then loads up the preview, essentially, and we have a few options: spherical, cylindrical, and perspective. All these are as projections, how the image is shown to you. So spherical is as if the image was projected onto the inside of a sphere. Cylindrical is onto the inside of a cylinder. It works really well with longer, wider images. And then perspective is where it's projecting onto a flat surface. Perspective is good for architecture type panoramas because it maintains the straight lines. Not very good for landscapes though, because it will give you a greater level of distortion at the edges as it tries to keep things all nice and flat. Cylindrical works for panoramas. Generally, I'll just keep it on spherical because that works well in most situations. And then see these edges here where it's stitched the pano together with a landscape, because if you haven't got any really specific details on the edge of your scene, I push this boundary warp up every single time and it just fills those gaps in by essentially skewing the image, and I think that just works really well. It doesn't look any worse once you've done that, and that's just a really nice thing to do. And then just click Merge. Lightroom or Photoshop will take a minute to put them together as it creates the panorama. There we are, that's now done. It's stitched into this file and it looks perfect. It's a DNG file, and then this is the final edit. Now these are big files, so they're going to take a little bit longer to load, but I really like the editing I've done on there. It's dramatic, it's moody, and yeah, I just think it looks great. But I want to print this image because I really love this image. It's one I took a little while ago and I think it's just going to work really well for the sake of this video. I'm excited to print this as well because my Canon Pro 1000 has recently upgraded its firmware, which now lets you feed in roll paper and produce a nice long panorama. Let's now send that off to the printer. I'm excited about this. It's going to take probably, 15 minutes, I reckon, to print that. So I'm not going to make you wait all that time, but let's talk about another thing first. If you followed all of the things we've already talked about and your image still does not stitch together, it's probably because of Parallax Shift. Now, what is Parallax Shift? Essentially, it is the change in perspective between the objects in your scene and your camera. So as you move around, the relationship between the objects in your scene changes. So if you look at this slider shot here, as the slide moves, you can see that the speed that the camera is moving in the frame is different to the speed in the background, and that is Parallax Shift. It works beautifully for a slider shot like this, but we don't want that in our panoramas because when we come to stitch it together, it won't work, essentially, because that movement just confuses the computer and it literally can't do it. So how do we avoid Parallax Shift? So the key thing to know is that it's only really going to be a problem if your subject is close to you. So people have yelled at me before when I've taken a panorama and not even thought about Parallax Shift or thought about it and dismissed it because it's not a problem. If you're taking a picture of a distant mountain scene, Parallax Shift is not going to be a problem for you. What you need to do to avoid Parallax Shift is rotate your camera around what they call the nodal point. The nodal point of your lens is where the aperture is, so where the light is going through the aperture, where the actual physical aperture is. Part of the reason I love this lens as well is because once I've mounted it on this neck mount here, that's pretty much right over the nodal point of this lens. So when I'm rotating it around that, it's rotating naturally around the nodal point. If you really want to avoid Parallax Shift and be technically perfect, you can buy a nodal rail, which is just a small piece of metal, a little bit like a macro slider, which just allows you to shift your camera back a bit or forward a bit to land the tripod right over the nodal point, and you'll then get those perfect panoramas. But in most cases, it's not something you need to worry about if, like I say, the scene that you're photographing is a decent distance away from you. And can you see that? It's so big. I love the size of it and how wide it is. Let me sit down. Not even going to sure I'm going to fit the whole thing in the frame. I am so chuffed with that. It literally gives you that impression and feel like you were there. It's printed beautifully. I think it looks great. And yeah, it's just so exciting seeing your photographs printed. For that print there, I've used this roll paper. It is a Canson Barita Photographic 2. That's a paper I love to use normally, and it comes in this roll. And that's what I've used with that printer, with that new firmware. Another option that I really love as well that will work with any A4 printer if you can adjust the print settings is this panoramic paper here from PhotoSpeed. PhotoSpeed, I buy all my paper from PhotoSpeed. And like I say, it's just so important, I think, to print your panoramas because they just, like I said earlier, don't look as good on the screen. Screens are not designed to display panoramas in their greatest form. So printing them out just makes all the difference. And then if you can end up with something like this, I just think you're going to be super chuffed. They have that wow factor, that extra bit of punch, that extra bit of impressiveness that we don't see all that often. So yeah, that is my ultimate guide to panorama photography. Please do subscribe to the channel, like the video, leave a comment, and then check out my book. All those things. That's a lot of things for you to do, isn't it? But yeah, I will see you again on another one very, very soon.